There's a question I've been sitting with for about 2 years now. Ever since I drove home through Charleston on a Wednesday afternoon with a box of notebooks in my passenger seat and a bottle of wine I probably shouldn't have taken. The question isn't about betrayal. It isn't about ageism or office politics or whatever HR-approved language you want to put around what happened to me. Those conversations are real, they matter. But they're not the thing that keeps me up at 3 inches the morning. The question is this: when you spend 17 years building something, not owning it, not running it, not signing the checks, not getting your name on anything but building it, learning every crack in the foundation, every relationship that keeps the whole structure breathing, every small invisible thing that has to happen every single day so that the guests walk in and feel something they can't quite name. What do you actually have? What's yours? Because on paper, the answer is nothing. You have your paycheck until you don't. You have your title until someone changes it on a spreadsheet. You have whatever professional relationships you built, and even those get contested the moment you walk out the door. But here's the thing nobody tells you about invisible work. When it disappears, the absence is very, very visible. My name is Margaret Thornton. Most people call me Meg. I spent 17 years as the wine director and head sommelier at the Caldwell House, a boutique luxury hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, that most of you have probably never heard of, unless you've spent serious money on a vacation in the Southeast in the last 20 years. And I want to tell you a story about what happened when a private equity firm bought the hotel, sent in a 31-year-old general manager with a Harvard MBA and a subscription to every hospitality industry newsletter that exists, and decided that the soul of a place is just another thing you can update like a software system. I want to tell you what I did, what I didn't do, and the difference between the two, because that difference is everything. Stick around. I have something I need to say, and I'm going to take my time saying it. Let me tell you about a bottle of wine first. Because this entire story has a bottle at the center of it, and if I start with the acquisition or the new GM or the day everything changed, you'll miss why any of it mattered in the first place. You need to understand what I was protecting before you can understand why it hurt to lose it. In September of 2008, a couple named Martin and Eloise Adler came to the Caldwell House for their honeymoon. They were teachers, both of them. High school history teachers from Columbia, South Carolina, who had been saving for 2 years for 3 nights at a place they'd seen in a magazine at a dentist's office. They weren't wine people. They didn't know the difference between a Burgundy and a Bordeaux. They were a little embarrassed. Actually, that specific kind of embarrassed that comes from wanting desperately to impress someone you love in a place that feels slightly out of your league. I remember Martin's face when he looked at the wine list. That very particular anxiety of a man trying to be impressive in a language he doesn't speak yet. I didn't hover. I sat down with them. Asked them not what they wanted to drink, but what they were celebrating, and what they wanted to feel. Eloise laughed. She said they wanted to feel like the kind of people who belong in places like this. So I brought them a Burgundy, a small production, 2005 Premier Cru from a grower who'd never exported more than 300 cases a year. Not showy. Not flashy. Quiet confidence, I told them. Wine for people who belong everywhere. Martin cried a little. Eloise laughed. They came back the following September for their first anniversary. In the year after that. By 2015, it had become what the staff quietly called the Adler Anniversary. Every September. Same week, different room, same table in the corner by the window overlooking the garden. I'd started setting aside bottles for them. Not the most expensive things in the cellar, the right things. Wine that aged alongside their marriage. In 2012, I found it. A 2009 Chambolle Musigny from a producer in Burgundy who made fewer than 500 cases a year. A woman named Sophie who tended her vines the way some people tend graves with devotion that has nothing to do with return on investment. I had 2 bottles. Sold 1 years back to a guest who knew what he was looking at. The other I put in the back of the reserve section, behind a tag that said nothing except a number I'd know. Their 20th anniversary was September of 2023. I held on to that bottle for 11 years for that night. But before I explain what happened to it, let me tell you what the wine cellar at the Caldwell House actually was. Not what it looked like, what it was. When I arrived in 2006, the hotel had what you generously call a beverage selection. 6 reds, 4 whites, a champagne that had been on the list since the hotel opened, and a rosé in a shade of pink I associate with convenience store slushies. The food and beverage budget for wine was $22,000 annually. The GM at the time shrugged when I asked about the program and said, "The guests don't really know the difference anyway. I started with 14 linear feet of temperature-controlled storage in a converted closet off the kitchen corridor. 17 years later, we had a 4,000-bottle climate-controlled cellar in a proper dedicated space I'd helped design. A rolling inventory with an average value of $580,000. 11 exclusive domestic winery relationships. 11 producers who did not sell to any other hotel or restaurant in the greater Charleston region. A quarterly wine dinner series with a waiting list that, at its peak, had 140 names on it. A per-bottle average that was consistently in the 92nd percentile for comparable boutique properties nationally. But that's the version that lives in spreadsheets. Let me tell you about the version that doesn't. I kept a notebook. A green composition notebook with water stains on the cover and coffee rings on about 40 pages. I'd been adding to it since my first week at the hotel. Every guest who'd had a meaningful experience around wine, what they ordered, what the occasion was, something they said, something I noticed. The Hendersons, who came every March and always asked for something from Oregon because that's where they met in college. Dr. Patel, who couldn't tolerate tannins after her chemotherapy but still wanted wine with dinner, and we found a way to make it work. The couple who came in on what was supposed to be a celebration dinner, and I could tell within 5 minutes something had broken between them. I brought them glasses of something light and left them alone, and they stayed for 3 hours and left holding hands. When you're a sommelier at the same place for 17 years, you become a particular kind of keeper. People tell you things they don't tell their therapists, because you're pouring them wine and the light is right and it's their anniversary, and somehow the story of how they almost didn't make it is just easier to say out loud. I was the memory of that hotel. Not the building. Not the brand. Not the thread count or the lobby Instagram photos or the F&B revenue per available room. The memory. The specific, human, uncategorizable memory. And in the spring of 2022, a private equity firm called Meridian Hospitality Partners purchased the Caldwell House for $11 million, filed the paperwork to bring it into their boutique portfolio, and sent a man named Derek Ashby to optimize operations. I want to be specific about what happened next, because the story I'm going to tell you is not the story you think you've heard before. Derek arrived on a Tuesday in April with a carry-on, a laptop bag, and that very particular energy that certain 31-year-old men carry when they've been told their whole lives that they're gifted and have finally found a professional context where the evidence appears to support it. Not arrogant, exactly. More like permanently at a velocity that doesn't leave room to notice what it's passing through. I want to be fair to Derek here. I'm actually going to try. He wasn't cruel in the beginning. He was something more complicated and, honestly, more dangerous than cruel. He was genuinely enthusiastic and genuinely incurious. He had energy without context, momentum without memory. He could tell you with impressive fluency what the industry metrics said should be happening. He could not tell you why Martin Adler cried over a glass of wine in 2008. He walked the hotel with an iPad and a hospitality operations app, and he asked good questions. How long have you had each supplier relationship? What's your reorder frequency? What's the per bottle margin on the wine program? What percentage of inventory turns in the first 90 days? And here is the part I think about most. I answered every single question. I walked him through the cellar for 2 hours on his 3rd day. I explained the exclusive relationships and the logic behind each one. I told him about the aging strategy and why certain bottles were in the reserve section with special tags. I told him about the guest preference records. I showed him the green notebook. I even told him about the Adlers, about Martin and Eloise and the 20-year anniversary and the Chambol Musigny I'd been holding since 2012. He leaned against one of the racks and looked at me with something that was genuinely warm. I want to give him that, and he said, "Meg, this is remarkable. You've built something really special here. It's going to be one of the things that makes this property stand out in our portfolio." I believed him. I want to sit with that for a moment. Not because I'm embarrassed, though I am, a little, but because I think that moment of genuine, unguarded trust is actually more true to human experience than the version of this story you usually see online. The one where the experienced employee sees through the new hire immediately, sizes up the threat from day one, and starts quietly laying their trap. That's satisfying to watch. It's not usually how it actually goes. Most of us extend good faith first. Most of us want to believe the new person has good intentions. Most of us have been somewhere long enough that we've forgotten what it looks like when someone comes in and sees a different story in the numbers than the one we've been living. So I told him everything. And it took about 6 weeks to start noticing the small things. The first was a supplier review meeting. Derek had sent around a spreadsheet. He loved spreadsheets the way some people love the sound of their own voice, and he'd added a column labeled Contract Efficiency. Next to each of our 11 exclusive winery relationships, He'd placed a number, revenue per bottle divided by industry average markup. 6 of our 11 relationships were below the column's threshold. I asked him what he was considering. Just exploring options, he said. Some of these margins are leaving money on the table. I explained carefully, the way you explain something to someone who is intelligent but missing critical context, that the exclusivity was the point. That you couldn't compare a relationship built over 15 years of mutual commitment to an industry average. That the Hendersons had specifically been coming to the Caldwell House for 9 years because we were the only hotel in Charleston carrying their favorite Oregon producer. That exclusivity creates something that efficiency metrics don't measure. The reason certain guests come back at all. Derek listened. He nodded. He typed something in his app. 3 weeks later, he informed 3 of the 11 wineries that the Caldwell House was moving to a spot buy model. 2 of them didn't renew under any arrangement. I need to tell you what it felt like to call Diane at Thornberry Cellars, a woman I'd worked with for 14 years, whose Pinot Noir had been on our list longer than some of our staff had been alive. Diane had planted a specific vineyard block in 2014 specifically for the Caldwell House. She'd named the block after our then head chef's wife, Elena, who had passed away the year prior. A small thing. The kind of small thing that doesn't appear in any efficiency analysis. Diane was gracious on the phone, professional, and then she said, "Is this coming from you, Meg? Or from new management?" I said it was from new management. She said, "Okay, I understand. I hope it works out for everyone." I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. I didn't do anything. I just sat there. The second thing happened in July. Derek brought in a hospitality operations consultant from Atlanta, the kind of firm that charges daily rates that make you reconsider capitalism, who spent 3 days at the property and produced a 47-page report. I read 32 pages of it before I had to put it down. It used phrases like guest experience standardization and beverage program alignment with parent portfolio and right-sizing inventory for operational efficiency. It recommended reducing the wine cellar from 4,000 bottles to a curated core selection of 60 labels. 60 labels. We had 4,000 bottles. We had 11 exclusive producers. We had guests who planned their anniversaries around this program. When I met with Derek to discuss the report, he'd brought the summary slide in his laptop. He pulled up a graphic showing projected cost savings. He said, "I know this feels significant, but we need the program to make sense at scale." "It doesn't scale," I said. "That's not an accident. That's the design." He looked at me with that specific expression, and I want you to hold this expression in your mind because it's going to matter later. Not contempt, not dismissal. Something more like sympathetic inevitability. The expression of someone who has already made the decision and feels genuinely bad that you don't understand yet. "Meg," he said, and his voice had gone careful and a little soft. "You've done something extraordinary here. I want you to know that. But we have to think about what works across the portfolio." I went back to the cellar after the meeting. I ran my hand along the reserve section, found the Chambol Musigny. September was 2 months away. The third thing happened in August, and this is the one I need you to pay attention to. A couple came in for dinner, Terrence and Amanda, who'd come for their engagement celebration 2 years prior and had made a reservation for their first anniversary. I knew them. I'd kept a note. Amanda was on a blood thinner and did better with lower alcohol wines. They had a running joke about terrible Merlot from their college days that they'd let me in on. I went to pull up their record in the guest preference system to check my notes. The system told me the file didn't exist. I searched again. Nothing. I called over to front desk and asked when the system migration had happened. 3 weeks ago, she said. IT handled it. What happened to the guest preference data? A pause. I think the old data didn't transfer. There was something about format compatibility. I found out later that Derek had authorized the switch to the hotel chain's centralized platform without any protocol for migrating the existing data. 12 years of guest preference records. Not corrupted. Not archived. Just not migrated. Gone. I made a specific decision in that moment not to say anything in front of the staff member I was standing next to. I walked to Derek's office. I knocked. I went in. I said, "Derek, I need to talk to you about the guest data migration." He said, "Oh yeah, I know, there were some complications with the legacy records." I said, "Those aren't legacy records, those are people. Those are 12 years of relationships with guests who come back to this hotel specifically because of what those records represent." He said, "I hear you, Meg, but we need to move forward on the new platform. It's already live. Can we recover any of it?" He said he'd look into it. He didn't look into it. I stood in the corridor outside his office for a moment and I had a thought I didn't say out loud. The thought was, he is not a bad person. He's not wrong in some narrow operational sense. He's just someone who has never in his professional life had to understand the difference between information and relationship. And because nobody taught him that difference, he genuinely cannot see what's being destroyed. That's not rage-inducing, exactly. It's lonelier than rage. And then came November. Derek asked me to come to his office on a Thursday afternoon. He had printed something. He slid it across the desk. It was a job description. My job. The job I had performed at the Caldwell House for 17 years. But the title had been changed to Beverage Program Coordinator. The salary line was $14,000 less than my current compensation. The reporting structure listed, reports to Operations Manager. The Operations Manager was 26 years old and had been at the hotel for 8 months. The role description read, coordinates beverage inventory in alignment with portfolio-approved vendor list, assists with ordering and receiving. I looked at the paper for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. I looked at Derek. He said, "We want to retain your institutional knowledge, but we need to restructure roles to align with the new model." I said, "You want me to inventory wine that someone else selected?" He said, "I know this is an adjustment." I said, "I understand what this is, Derek. Here is what I did not say. I did not make a speech. I did not tell him what I thought of the last 7 months. I did not cry. I did not let him see me process this in real time." I picked up the paper. I folded it in half. I put it in my jacket pocket. I said, "I'm going to need a few days to think about this." He said, "Of course, take the weekend." I walked out of his office and down the service corridor and through the kitchen and into the cellar. I stood in the cellar for about 20 minutes, just stood, listened to the hum of the climate control, looked at the racks I'd filled over 17 years. The Henderson's Oregon producer in Section 4. Dr. Patel's low tannin favorites in Section 7, the reserve section in the back. I found the Caldwell House. I put it in my bag. I went home. That night I opened my laptop and I wrote 17 sentences, one for each year. None of them accusatory, none of them explanatory. I said I'd been honored to serve the Caldwell House and its guests. I said I believed the wine program would continue to bring joy to people who chose the hotel for important moments. I thanked the people I'd worked alongside. I sent it at 7:43 in the morning before Derek arrived. It was a resignation letter. Here is what nobody tells you about resigning with dignity. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like leaving a house you've lived in for 17 years, except the house was never yours. And while you were driving away, someone already started knocking down the walls. I went back on a Saturday to collect my things. Clara was there, my junior sommelier, 27 years old, the best palate I'd worked with in a decade. She helped me carry boxes without saying much. When we were done, she hugged me in the parking lot and held on for a while. She was the kind of person who doesn't cry easily. She didn't cry then, but her face was doing something complicated. She said, "What do I do now?" I said, "Do your job well. The rest is not yours to carry." She nodded. I could tell she didn't believe me. I'm not sure I fully believed myself. I drove home with the boxes and the notebooks, 17 years of handwritten documentation that technically belonged to me and that nobody had thought to ask about, paper backups of guest records, correspondence with winemakers, notes on harvests, a whole archive of relationship that existed entirely outside any system. I also drove home with the Caldwell House. I put it in the small wine rack in my kitchen. I looked at it for a while, and then I did something I hadn't let myself do in 17 years of working around wine for other people. I opened it. I know, it was earmarked for something, but Eloise and Martin weren't coming to my kitchen. September had come and gone, and I wasn't at the Caldwell House, and nobody who was still at the Caldwell House knew the bottle existed. The wine didn't know it was supposed to wait. So I opened it on a Tuesday afternoon and I drank it alone at my kitchen table and I cried. Not because of Derek. Not specifically because of the job or the title or the $14,000. I cried because I'd made a quiet promise to myself about that bottle, about delivering a specific thing at a specific moment to specific people who mattered, and I'd let myself be removed before I could keep it. The wine was extraordinary. Everything I'd hoped from 11 years of aging. It tasted like the thing it was. Time and care and patience, come fully due. It tasted like it had been waiting and was now, finally, allowed to be what it always was. I sat with the empty glass for a long time. Then I started thinking about what to do with the rest of my life. Here's where I have to be honest with you in a way that doesn't make a clean story. Nothing happened automatically. I didn't have a failsafe buried in the system. I didn't have a legal clause that activated when I signed the resignation letter. The hotel kept running. Derek stayed in his office. The wine program was, by all measurable criteria, right-sized. For 3 months, I did consulting work on a freelance basis, tastings, a couple of local restaurant clients who needed wine program development. I updated my resume for the first time in 17 years, which I'll just tell you is a particular kind of humbling experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I applied for 4 positions, heard back from 2, was told by one hiring manager gently that I was overqualified for the current role structure. I was 58 years old with 17 years of specialized expertise and a track record that was, objectively, exceptional. And the phrase overqualified sat in my chest for about a week. So I want to be clear. There was a period of uncertainty. A real one. It was not a movie montage. It was 3 months of quiet anxiety and a lot of coffee, and the occasional 3 a.m. question of whether I'd made the right choice. And then things started happening. Not because I'd engineered them, not because I'd made calls, but because relationships are not a system you can optimize. They are a network of trust, and when you remove the person at the center of a trust network, the network doesn't route around the absence, it notices it. The first call came from Frank Murillo, whose family had been making wine in Sonoma for 3 generations and had been exclusive partners with the Caldwell House since 2011. Frank called my personal cell on a Thursday morning. He wasn't calling to ask for advice. He was calling because Derek had reached out to transition his exclusive arrangement to a spot-buy model, the 3rd such call Frank had gotten from a Meridian property in a year, and Frank was upset. Not business upset, people upset. He'd built something with the Caldwell House over 11 years, and he was being handed a form letter. We talked for an hour. I didn't tell him what to do. I listened. I told him what I knew about the new ownership structure and what it seemed to value. I told him, honestly, that I didn't think it was personal, that Derek probably didn't understand what he was walking away from. Frank said, "That's almost worse, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it kind of is." 3 weeks later, Frank and 2 other winery families withdrew their exclusivity from the Caldwell House. Not because I asked them to. Because Derek had replaced the relationship with a transaction, and a transaction without relationship is just a contract with an expiration date. The second call came from Patricia Wentworth, a guest who'd been coming to the Caldwell House every February for 11 years. Patricia had called to make her reservation and been put through to a centralized booking system that had no record of her preferences, no acknowledgement of her history with the hotel. She'd been offered a standard room when she'd been in the garden suite for 7 years running. When she'd asked to speak with the sommelier, she'd been told the position was currently in transition. She called my personal cell. She had my card from 4 years ago and she'd kept it in her wallet. She said, "Meg, what happened? Where did you go?" I told her I'd left. I asked if she was okay. She said, "I booked somewhere else." I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. And I also mean this. In the 7 years Patricia had been coming to the Caldwell House, she had conservatively spent between $12,000 and $15,000 per visit. Over 7 years, you do that math. I didn't do anything with those calls. I received them, I listened. I did not orchestrate anything. I'm being specific about this because it matters. What happened next was not revenge. It was consequence. There's a difference. And the difference is important. Now, here's the part I've thought about the most. In February, Clara called me. She was still at the hotel, still doing her job, as I'd told her to, but she'd been doing the quarterly inventory, a task that had fallen to her after the program restructuring, and she'd found something she didn't know what to do with. 3 cases of reserve designation bottles were listed in the system as removed for staff development. 47 bottles, approximately. In the records, no corresponding training logs, no tasting notes, no event documentation. The bottles were worth, at conservative retail, somewhere between $300 and $800 each. She'd been sitting on this information for 6 weeks, trying to convince herself there was an explanation. She asked me what she should do. I'm going to be honest with you about what I felt when I heard that. There was a version of me, and I'm not proud of this version. But she exists who felt something like satisfaction. Not because I'd wanted this, but because there's a deeply human part of us that wants the story to be clean, wants the bad actor to be provably bad, in writing, in a way that the world can see. I sat with that feeling for a moment, and then I did what you have to do with feelings like that. I acknowledged it, and I didn't act on it, because here's what was actually true. I had no standing. I had no access to current inventory systems. I was a former employee with obvious grievances. Any documentation I provided or claims I made would come from a disgruntled ex-staff member with personal motivation. Even if the investigation went correctly, it would put Clara, 27 years old, dependent on this job, trying to build a career in an impossible position. So I did something much less satisfying than the story you want to hear. I called a hospitality attorney, not to build a case for myself, to understand what Clara's options were as a current employee who had legitimate access to inventory records and a documented, specific concern. I paid for 1 hour of her time. I got Clara the information she needed to understand her choices, what protections existed, what the process looked like, what the risks were. Then, I let Clara decide. She reported it through the parent company's internal compliance line. Anonymously. That's a different story with a different resolution, and it is not mine to tell. What I can tell you is this. By April, Derek Ashby had left the Caldwell House. The official announcement cited strategic restructuring of senior leadership. There was no press release. And what I can tell you is that in May, I received a call from the Meridian Hospitality Partners corporate office. They were looking for a consultant to restore several key vendor relationships and rebuild the wine program's regional standing. They offered a day rate that was genuinely generous. I thanked them for thinking of me. I said I wasn't available. I want to pause here and say something that might complicate your feelings about this story. I don't think Derek was evil. I want to say that clearly. He was 23 years too young to have the context for what he was managing. He was working from a framework efficiency, optimization, scale that is not inherently wrong. It's just catastrophically insufficient for certain kinds of value, and nobody taught him the difference, or if they did, the incentive structure he was operating inside didn't reward him for applying it. There are systems that produce Derek's, that recruit for his specific combination of intelligence and curiosity and reward them handsomely for doing exactly what he did. I've been in this industry long enough to have seen it happen at a dozen properties. Getting angry at Derek specifically is like getting angry at a hammer for being a hammer. What's worth being angry at, and I'll be honest, what I am still angry at is the part where 17 years of built relationship and specific knowledge can be decided irrelevant by someone who arrived 3 weeks ago and is reading a 47-page report. What's worth grieving, and I did grieve it, is that there's no system in place to protect the thing I was protecting. No mechanism by which what I knew could be transferred, preserved, or even acknowledged as the asset it actually was. When I left, I took it with me, not because I planned to, but because it lived in me. In the notebook, in the green composition book with the coffee rings. And the hotel became a slightly worse version of itself. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just a little less specific. A little less the place that remembered you. That happens every day, at properties everywhere, and it almost never makes the news. Let me tell you what actually happened with the rest. I started a consulting practice in January of that year. I work now with 4 hotel clients in the Southeast and 2 independent restaurants. I have, at the moment, a 6-month wait list for new clients. I don't have a 4,000-bottle cellar. I don't have a staff. I don't have a green composition notebook that's been going for 18 years. But I have the work. The actual work, not the job description. In March, I called Eloise Adler. I'd been thinking about doing it for months and kept finding reasons to wait. I called her on a Sunday morning. Told her I'd left the Caldwell House, that I hadn't been there for September, that I was sorry I hadn't let her know. She said, "Oh, Meg, we wondered." I said, "I had a bottle for you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happened to it?" I told her I'd opened it, alone, at my kitchen table, in November. That it had been extraordinary, that I'd cried a little. She laughed, the warm, specific laugh I'd known for 15 years. She said, "That's perfect, actually. That's exactly right. Martin would have loved that." She'd said would have, past tense. I paused. She said, "He passed in August. Heart attack. Very fast. We didn't end up doing much for the anniversary this year." I didn't know what to say. I said, "Eloise, I'm so sorry." She said, "I know. Me too." And then, after a moment, "Tell me about the wine. Tell me what it was like." So I did. I told her everything about that bottle, the producer in Burgundy, the vineyard, the 11 years of aging, what it tasted like in November, light at my kitchen table, what it tasted like to drink something that had been waiting patiently to be exactly what it was. She listened. She didn't say much. At the end she said, "Good, that's a good way for it to have gone." We talked for about an hour. She told me about Martin. I told her about the new consulting work. She asked if she could call again sometime. I said yes. I want to leave you with something, and I'm going to try to say it clearly. I keep encountering versions of this story, the one where the person who was wronged had secretly prepared for it, had laid the trap, had pulled the lever at the right moment, and watched everything crumble from a safe distance with a glass of wine in their hand. That version is extremely satisfying. I understand why it gets told. I've wished more than once that my story was that version. But here's what I actually think is true. The invisible work doesn't protect you. Not in any practical, transactional sense. Nobody is going to notice what you've been holding together until it comes apart. And even then, the lesson rarely lands where it needs to. The people who make the decisions that remove you are often not in the room when the consequences arrive. The vindication when it comes is usually partial and quiet, and often arrives too late to feel like anything you'd call justice. And yet, the work was real. The relationships were real. 17 years of people telling me things they didn't tell anyone else, and me trying to match them with the right glass of something that would let them feel, for 2 hours, like the world was generous. That doesn't disappear because someone put it in a box labeled legacy and set it aside. It went somewhere. It went with me. It's in the clients I work with now. It's in the conversations I had with Clara and Frank and Patricia. It's in the call with Eloise on a Sunday morning in March. What you carry when you leave isn't the job. It isn't the cellar or the program or the wait list. It's the knowledge that you were capable of it, that you did it, that it was real. There's a bottle in my kitchen rack right now. I don't know who it's for. I don't know what occasion it's waiting for. Maybe that's the point. Maybe you build the program and keep the relationships and hold the wine and you find out what it was for when you find out. Maybe that's the whole job. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the invisible things. They are the only things that last. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me about the thing you built that someone decided was a legacy overhead. The comments are open. I'm listening. I always have been.